My name is Houston Gordon. I'm in Jackson, Tennessee today on August 21, 2007. I'm here to interview Justice Lyle Reed of Brownsville, Tennessee. The interview is taking place as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation and the Tennessee Supreme Court Historical Society. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Houston.
Tell us your full name.
My full name is Thomas Lyle Reed.
And where do you live?
I live in Brownsville, Tennessee.
And could you tell us the street address or road address?
2302 Highway 54 North, Brownsville, Tennessee.
And that's not in the city, is it?
It is not in the city. We live in the suburb of Brownsville. Of course, Brownsville is 10,000 people, so suburbs has a sort of general description of where I live.
And what is, who do you live with there?
I live with Elizabeth Winfrey Walker Reed, my wife of some 53 or 4 years.
And tell us when you and Libba, as I know her, when y'all met.
Elizabeth and I met on the corner in front of the E&E drugstore on February the 5th, 1953. It was a blind date. A mutual friend thought we might get along okay. I had just returned from the Air Force, was going back to the University of Tennessee, and they arranged this blind date. I called her on the phone and to confirm that she was in fact going to show up, and we had not seen each other. So I said, I'm tall and not so handsome, and she says, well, I'm short and beautiful, and that's the way it turned out.
And it's still that way?
It's still that way.
Well, tell us about your family. Tell us about your parents.
My parents, well, in my family, generations are long. Like my father was born in 1887 and died about 1900. And his name was Henry Clay Reed.
What was the date of his death?
About 1900. Wait a minute, let me get, yes, about 1900.
Your father or your grandfather?
My grandfather, Henry Clay. Oh, okay. Let's talk. You asked me about my father. Okay,
yes.
Sorry. I'm one generation back, Houston. My father was named William Thomas Reed. He was born in 1887, and he died at 95, about in 1982.
And who was your mother?
My mother was Jo Stella Williamson, and she was born in 1896, and she died in 1993. She was about 97 when she died.
So longevity is in your family.
I sure hope so.
Well, tell me about do you have any brothers or sisters?
Yes, it was a big family, 6 sons and 2 daughters. I was the 7th. And there is a superstition that the 7th child is lucky, particularly if it's a boy. And I think that has turned out to be true in my case. I had 5 brothers and 2 sisters, all but one older than I.
All right. Tell me about those brothers and sisters. Tell me about the oldest sister.
Well, my oldest sister, Jessie Mae, was my very good friend. She was my 5th grade school teacher, actually. And she lived at home with us. You remember that I grew up as a small child during World War II. Everybody was either in the Army or their husband was in the Army or something. So she lived at home with us and taught school while her husband was in the Army. My next older brother did not go to the war. My next older brother.
What was your sister's name?
Jessie Mae.
And she just died, what, last year?
She died last year.
All right. Now, the next oldest was a brother.
His name was Noel. And
Tell us about him.
well, he was, for those of us who live out in the country, and there's not very much we can say, he was a good friend of mine. He started out as a farmer, and then he started to build houses, which is what he did the latter part of his life. And he did not go to the war. That was the big thing back in those days, whether you went to the war or not. My next brother did go to the war. He volunteered before Pearl Harbor and stayed in the Army about 4 years. He came back and was a soil conservation agent in Decatur County, where you spent some time.
That's Parsons.
At Parsons.
In Decaturville.
Until he retired, and he died in 1993, the same year my mother died.
And what was his name?
Terry.
And then you had another sister.
I had another sister, Pauline. Husband was in the Army. She taught school most of her, all of her life. Her husband was also a school teacher, principal, superintendent, and they both are still living.
And where do they live?
They live in Paris, Tennessee.
Up in Henry County.
Henry County. Have 2 daughters, and they live next door to their daughters.
All right, and then your brother Russell.
Brother Russell was a Methodist minister, and he, of course, has retired. Everybody's retired but me, and I'm trying to retire. He was a Methodist minister, and he lives in Ripley,
Tennessee. And then there's the youngest brother, who those of us who practice in federal court got to know. What's his name?
Right, Franklin, named I think for President Roosevelt. Franklin was long-term first bankruptcy court clerk and then clerk of the Federal District Court in Memphis.
All right, and then I left out one. I left out
Roland.
All right, and he was right in front of you.
He was right in front of me in many ways. He was, we all started as farmers, I guess, and later on he bought a convenience store and just sold it last year.
All right, now how many of you total?
8.
And where did y'all grow up?
We grew up in Haywood County,
and
out on a farm.
What's the name of that community?
You know, that community is, I wrote somewhere, they say, where are you from? And I always say I'm from Haywood County, Brownsville. You can't really say you're from Poplar Corner Road because we're about the only house there. So it was a very rural area. We lived on a farm in Haywood County. It's in the direction of Jackson. In fact, I was born, before we moved to the farm, I was born on the edge of Madison County. And we bought a farm when I was small and lived there the rest of until I went to college.
When were you born?
1930.
And what was the date?
June the 17th.
June the 17th of 1930. So
Right.
that would have been at the beginning of the Depression.
Yes. And I experienced all of it.
Well, tell us about that a little bit.
Well, the Depression on a farm in Tennessee, I don't think we knew we were poor. We had all the necessities of life, but we had not much more. And we worked. We grew cotton and corn, and I worked in the field as a child. And
Did you chop cotton?
I chopped cotton. I tell people, after you've chopped cotton, you can do anything. Everything else is easy after you've chopped cotton.
And then tell us about your education. Where'd you go to school?
Well, I went to Holly Grove Elementary School, a 2-room school. It was about a mile from home. We walked, of course. And
Was that up the road from the Holly Grove Baptist Church?
well, it's right on the same grounds as Holly Grove Baptist Church. And interesting enough that you mentioned that this before the separation of church and state had much traction in Haywood County. They would turn out school and march us all over to the church for the revival, which was an interesting education, I guess.
Now, you and Libba dated from the time you met her in front of the E&E.
Yes.
How long?
Well, we met on February the 5th, 1953, and we married on December the 5th, 1953, 9 months later.
All right, tell us where the E&E is.
The E&E, everyone who attended the University of Tennessee knows that that's where the Student Center is now, at the corner of Cumberland and 15th Street. And
in Knoxville?
In Knoxville, Tennessee.
All right, and the E&E was even there when I was in school.
The E&E was an institution for many, many years.
All right, and tell us, I got you out of elementary school at Holly Grove, but we didn't get to high school. Where'd you go?
Haywood High, the county high school, from 1944 to 1948. Not a terribly eventful time. But that's not right. It was eventful because that's when I fell in love with learning stuff, and books became my best friend.
And who do you think had an effect on you, making you love to read and to learn?
I think it would have been an effort to keep me from it. I think that was what interested me, and I think maybe that's why I ended up in the legal profession.
All right. And after you graduated from Haywood High School in 1948, what'd you do?
Well, the big event in my life till that point was graduation night, and one of the local merchants decided to give a scholarship to a graduating boy and a graduating girl, Mr. Joel and Mr. Nathan Tam. They were in the dry good business on Court Square. And their nephew, Mr. Fred Silverstein. They gave an award, which we called the Tam Scholarship Award, and I was the recipient. And I knew when they announced my name that night that I was off to college, and we'd see what next. So I went from there to the University of Tennessee in September.
How'd you get up there?
Well, making decisions about where to go to college and life-changing events nowadays are there's a great deal of agitation and consultation and thought and writing all for stuff. I guess mine was a little bit more simple than that. There was a friend up the road who was going to UT.
Up the road where?
Up the road from where I lived. In fact, his dad ran the store. And in fact, I had worked in the store when I was in high school, and he said, if you want to go to UT, I'll be leaving on Saturday or sometime, and I'll give you a ride up, and you can move in with me. And I did.
And had any of your brothers and sisters gone to college before you did?
Yes.
Who?
My older sister had gone to Union University in Jackson, and my older brother had gone to Lambeth. The next brother got caught in the war, and he eventually graduated from UT, but they were the two.
All right. And so you caught your neighbor?
I caught my neighbor a ride to UT, and I stayed there. I started out in pre-law in liberal arts. You remember in those days you could do 3 years in pre-law either in liberal arts or business administration. I took liberal arts. Political science was my major, and I was there. That year was fairly uneventful, and then the Korean War started breathing down our necks. So during the summer after my first year in college, I volunteered for the Air Force. Not very patriotic, actually, because I knew the draft was going to get me in a few days, and I certainly didn't want to go to the infantry. So I volunteered for the Air Force, and the recruiter said, I told him I wanted to learn to fly, because as a child working on the farm, there was an air base at Jackson where they taught pilot training. And I spent many a time leaning on my hoe watching these guys up in the sky practicing dogfighting and all that. And so I said, okay, I'll take flight training. And it was then, during the physical, he cheated a little bit on my height. 6'3" is as tall as you could be and be a pilot, go to pilot training. He said, well, I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt on your height. I'm going to call it 6'3". And but when we got to the colorblind test, he said, I can't help you here. So there went my flying career. And
so now you're in the Air Force.
I'm in the Air Force, and there was some discussion about what to do now, and I wasn't real sure. My main interest was to get out and get home, and they offered me some alternatives. And the good ones, something about a language school in Monterey, California. I would have to up my enlistment to longer term, and by then I was pretty sure that I wanted to come back home, and staying in the Air Force any longer wasn't really in my best interest. Actually, I did get extended, so I probably should have taken the deal to go to language school. I would have learned Russian, and Lord knows where I would be today. But who questions that?
Well, where did you do your basic training?
I did basic training in Lackland, at Lackland Air Force Base in near San Antonio, and then after that, they said, well, if you can't decide what you want to do, we'll just put you in the MPs. You're tall and hardy looking, so that was my training at Camp Gordon, Georgia. And then from Camp Gordon, I went to Rhein-Main Air Base in Germany, which was a delightful place to spend 2.5 years.
So you served as a military policeman?
Right. It was still occupation, and the military police were all the police. We did all the things that the police does: accident, crime, traffic, guard important generals like Eisenhower and the Supreme Commander. Rhein-Main was the big air base in Germany at that time, where all the flights came in. It's Frankfurt, and so we did stuff like that.
Well, tell me, had you met Libba at this point?
No, I met Libba after I had finished with the Air Force and came back home in December of 1952, went back to UT in January, and met Libba in February.
So you were a single guy while you were in?
I was single, yes.
In Germany?
Right.
All right. Then, did anything exciting happen while you were a military policeman over there? What did you do?
Oh, everything from guard the gate to the base to traffic control. We had a highway patrol section. And I felt kind of guilty at the time, and I still feel kind of guilty. You know, there were a lot of important, exciting things to do, but I really enjoyed being in Germany. It was a great place to be. The war had been over about 4 years. It was not destitute anymore. The people were friendly, very nice. They welcomed Americans. And the only really creative thing that I did while I was in the Air Force in Germany was I continued to go to college. I went to University of Maryland, had a campus, and I got about a year's credit at the University of Maryland, which helped me along my way into getting to be a lawyer.
So then you became a short timer and got out of the service and did what?
Well, I went back to college and finished transferred over into the business administration pre-law course, finished that, and then went into law school in Knoxville. As I say, you could do it all in 6 years then. So I had gotten about a year at the University of Maryland. So I was finished with my education, had my military service done. I was still 27.
All right, when you went to law school, at the time you went to law school, had you known lawyers growing up?
No.
And so what prompted you to go to law school?
Well, I did know one lawyer. There was Chancellor John Gray, for whom I worked later, used to come to the school and make inspirational talks. He was a good man, but I didn't care much for his talks, actually. But I knew him by sight, and why did I go to law school? I'm not sure. I could try to give a clever answer, but I'm not sure how truthful it would be. As near as I can come to it, I was just curious about how people interacted with each other. And I wanted to see people at their best and at their worst. And I didn't want to be a doctor or have anything to do with illnesses. So I probably was not a very enlightened decision, but that's how I got there.
But tell me if you had any favorite professors.
Dr. Lacey.
Forrest Lacey?
Dr. Forrest Lacey, who taught constitutional law. Colonel Warner, who taught real property. And if you can imagine, he made real property exciting. I still remember his lectures about the sticks in a bundle, making a fee simple. Future interest was intriguing because it separated out something that was solid, like this table, into concepts. Dr. Overton was a little bit too taken with himself. For me, he was a brilliant guy, but he bounced around a little more than I could keep up with him.
I'm sure you learned that jurisdiction is what you can't do if you don't do, even if you do it, or something to that effect.
Your memory's better than mine, or else I wasn't paying attention that day.
Well, and Dr. Lacey used the Socratic method?
Yes.
All right. And after you got out of law school, what'd you do?
Well, this looking back that I've been doing for the last few days, knowing that we were going to do this today, is kind of a interesting thing for me, because I don't usually look back very much. Yesterday, whatever happened yesterday is past and gone, and if it happened, if it turned out okay, fine. If it didn't, I'm not going to worry very much about it, because there's more going on today that I can deal with. So looking back at the past in this exercise has really been kind of interesting. And one of those things that I thought about when I look back is, why did I consistently stay in Brownsville? I mean, Brownsville is a great place. It's a nice little town. Farmers, it's not particularly pretty. We're poor. The county is poor. We haven't grown. And why I wanted to stay there has really been kind of a curiosity to me, but I never gave any serious thought about anywhere else. I went to Nashville for a couple of years as assistant state attorney general. But when I signed on with Gerald McCandless, I told him, he asked me to promised to stay for at least 2 years. And at the same time, I told him, I really expect to go back to Brownsville and learn to practice law. And I won't stay more than 5, I'm sure. And then when I left the Attorney General's office, there were some opportunities. I could have certainly could have stayed in Nashville with some of the law firm. I could have done other things, but for some reason that I don't fully understand, I always went back to Brownsville.
And I want to jump in and go from law school back to your private practice in Brownsville.
Okay.
But I want, before we do that, catch us up with you and Libba. Between that time, you went back to law school.
Right. Well, Lib and I met right after, a month after I got back to UT, and then we were married that same year. She was a senior. Well, she had graduated when we married, and she was off doing things with the Danforth Foundation, and she tells me that she was seriously tempted to forget me and go away. She was at some college or someplace doing something with the Danforth Foundation, and I told her that I very well could understand if she decided to do that. But anyway, she came back, got a job, and we stayed there. I went to college. I had a couple of jobs on the side, and she worked, and we stayed there until 1956, when I graduated from law school, end of '56. Right.
And then what did y'all do?
We went to Brownsville.
Where'd you live?
We rented an apartment, and I hung out my shingle.
Well, tell us about that.
Well, again, I'm not quite sure. I'm sure the gods were looking after me, but I made arrangements for an office with Mr. John Norris, who was an established lawyer, and an arrangement to share his secretary. But I was on my own. I was just me. And so we started to practice law. And it was very good. Folks are charitable, and if you're halfway smart and try hard, they'll help you. It's been my experience. Along came the job with Chancellor Gray. Chancellor Gray was a truly important person in my life, because he was having difficulty seeing, so he hired me before trial judges had law clerks. I think I was on the payroll as his secretary. Anyway, I drove for him. We had 9 counties in West Tennessee, and we spent many hours in the car going to and from court, from Brownsville to Union City and Dresden and Somerville and Dyersburg and all over. So on lots of days there would be at least an hour going and an hour coming, and he and I were confined to the same car. And he liked to talk, and I liked to listen. And he had been an excellent lawyer, and he was a good judge. He was a very ethical, honorable man of the old school, and I think he was trying to impress me with some good thoughts and some good habits. And he allowed me to talk to him in a very frank way. Like, we'd hear a case, and on the way home, I remember saying to him, well, call him Judge Gray, it seemed to me that you were helping the guy that didn't have the good lawyer. Are you supposed to do that? And he said, well, it's a difficult thing for a judge, because what we really want to do is do justice, but we really ought to, if somebody hires a poor lawyer, they just about suffer the consequences of hiring a lawyer that's not very good or not very well prepared. And he said, I sort of try to make sure that justice is done without taking part too much. Very conscientious approach. I can't fault him in the way he did it. Of course, at that time, I was so smart and cocky, I just said, well, you ought to let him try. You know, if he hires a fool as a lawyer, you ought to suffer the consequences. I changed my view about that later, actually.
And how long did you clerk for
I
Judge
clerked for
Gray?
him until 1960, when I had my first judicial experience. I ran for General Sessions Court of Haywood County and was elected. And I served for 9 months and was bored totally to death. There just wasn't much to do. I couldn't practice law, and there was not enough business. The court didn't have enough business to even keep your interest up. And so General McCandless was looking for an assistant from West Tennessee.
And General McCandless was the state attorney general?
He was the state attorney general. And he asked a friend of mine if he would like to be the assistant, and my friend said, no, I don't, but you might talk to Lyle Reed. He might be interested. So he called me, and I went up and stayed with him for 2 years, from 1961 to 1963.
And what did you do while you were there?
Well, that was in the days when the Attorney General's office had, I believe there were 13 of us. And this was even before the departments, like the Department of Insurance or Banking, had separate counsel. We did work for the entire state government. I remember doing a bond issue for the Department of Education, if you can imagine. I represented the Department of Banking. I learned about banks, and one of the first things that I did when I went back to Brownsville to practice law, my father and I organized a bank, and which we kept until somebody bought it a few years ago.
Your father or father-in-law?
Father-in-law.
Okay. And then while you were in the Attorney General's office, tell us what the exposure that you got there meant to you later on. You mentioned banking.
Right. Well, and I guess the big, well, it all was big to me. The people, the Nashville lawyers, the judges, General McCandless, the other assistant attorney generals, interaction with like the Department of Revenue. I represented the Game and Fish Commission and went down to Lake County and tried a jury case in Lake County in which the state was trying to take these guys fishing holes, and that was an exciting experience. But the point is that I got really good experience in the Attorney General's office. It was not just strictly an office practice, even though it was mostly, and the work was exciting and interesting, and the reason I left is because I knew I was having so much fun that I wouldn't ever really learn to be a lawyer if I didn't get out of there. It was all too easy, and so we had some colorful characters, Cussin Henry Fouch and Tom Fox, really nice people to work with, and we all had a good time. But it was too easy. I had to get out into the real world.
So what'd you do?
So I went back to Brownsville, 1963, and back into the business of Lyle Reed, attorney at law. The people were nice. In 1965, well, in the Attorney General's office, I had my taste of state politics and state government and the world of the law outside of my small town. So in 1965, I ran for the Constitutional Convention and won, and went to Nashville again in the convention. That was a fairly interesting convention. That was a convention in which the the legislative branch was reorganized. It was.
Well, wasn't that the convention where the legislature became independent?
Yes, they authorized annual sessions, set their own budget. The fiscal review committee began. The governor was required to submit his budget to the legislature in advance, And it worked together pretty well because I had so much fun in '65 in the Constitutional Convention that I decided to run for the legislature, which I did, House of Representatives. 2 years later in 1960.
What area?
Haywood and Crockett counties, 2 counties.
And what year did you run?
I was there in 1967 and 68, 1 term. Took 1 term to learn that I could not be a successful legislator and run a one-man, one-person law practice. But the 1967 session of the General Assembly was the first annual session, and we did some pretty interesting things. We created the Court of Criminal Appeals, and it was a very, we did a lot of stuff, but if you can imagine, there were no offices, no staff. The docket or the agenda would be piled on my desk when I got there in the morning, maybe 6 inches to 1.5 foot high. Would be the first time that we would know that the bills were going to be acted upon. Well, the General Assembly decided that was not a good way of doing business. Of course, everybody who knows about state government knows that until that time, it was strictly an executive function. The governor got what the governor wanted. And it was interesting, Houston, that in the convention, the question over and over and over was, well, can we trust the legislature? Well, my answer was no, but you don't have any choice because the power is somewhere. And to limit the power of the General Assembly, though it may look like an exercise in restraint, just transfers the power to the governor and to the bureaucracy. So the best shot is to have it in the people who have to go home and get reelected. And that's the public's safeguard better than having a one-person government.
Well, tell me, or tell everyone else, what
Who
party
will
did
listen
you
to
run
anybody?
for?
Pardon?
What party did you run?
I ran as a Democrat. Of course, at that time, the Republicans were unheard of in Tennessee.
Were there any in Haywood County?
No, well, I think there were 3.
All right. And so you ran as a Democrat and you were elected as a Democrat.
That's not quite right. Obviously, actually, what was beginning to happen was the swing to the conservative thing. The civil rights, all my time in Brownsville is about, Haywood County is about 50-50 black and white. It's relatively poor. It's not relatively poor, it's poor. And all of the things that we know that happened beginning in the 60s and into the 70s were happening in a very dramatic way in Haywood County. And it was all of a sudden the very thing to do to become a Republican.
All right. I want to get to that in a minute, but you served in the legislature for how long?
Just 1 term in the House.
All right. And then you, obviously, you're still in Brownsville, and at some point did you get involved in county government?
Yes, I ran for county attorney in 1965, I believe it was, the same year that I was in the convention. And we were mixing it up a little bit there in the county. The county attorney before me, anyway, I decided to run for county attorney, and very interesting session. The county commission, which was called the county court then, voted 3 times before they could break the tie between me and my predecessor. And I was elected county attorney, and in the process, right away started to represent the county in its many civil rights cases.
Right. And I want to talk to that in a moment, but you served as county attorney in Haywood County for how long?
From 1965 until I stopped practicing law in 1986.
So you served for 21 years.
Yes.
All right. Now, as county attorney, we're in the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson is president of the United States.
And he was my chief opponent when I ran for the General Assembly. My Republican opponent just came along for the ride. The guy I ran against was Lyndon Johnson. And being a Democrat, there was very strong feelings. In my county, it's difficult to imagine, but one of the first things that I faced when I got home to practice law was, well, when I went home to practice law, African Americans did not vote in Haywood County. They had not voted in a good number of years. And the effort was being made for them to register and to vote. And as totally unreal as it may seem, that effort was resisted by many in the community. And I had just gotten out of law school and I thought was a really profound respect for the Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights. And all this was disturbing. And as county attorney, I tried to steer the county onto a lawful course, but I had to maintain some credibility with the power structure, with the people who made the decisions. And that was all away from what was called the sharecroppers suit. I didn't represent the county in that. That was filed in federal court before I got there, but I got right on the end of it. An injunction in federal court to not violate people's constitutional right to register and vote. Well, from there it went on, the schools. I was county attorney all during the time of the integration of the schools. And I guess there were not many years in which I was not involved in some part of civil rights litigation.
Now, I've talked to you a lot over the last 30 years or so, and one of the things that I wanted to ask about for this project is this idea of a social conscience that you have that I've recognized in the 1960s and 1970s. Tell us where that came from.
Well, I'm not sure. It would seem to me everyone should be born with a social conscience. To me, I guess it took real life in my little town, because there were bad influences and good influences, and people would like to be decent, but they're not always. Sometimes it takes an effort to break out of what has been a way of doing things. I had at college. Lib and I had attended the Unitarian Church in Knoxville, and which was very liberal, was integrated at the time that we were there in the early 50s, middle 50s, which was unheard of in Tennessee at that time. Same time, the racial unrest was happening out in Clinton, joining Anderson County. And so you can know from that by general standards, I was pretty liberal in my politics and my sense of fairness to people.
Well, tell me how that affected you and Libba personally during your representation of the county. You obviously are trying to walk this narrow line between your employers, who are the power brokers, and then the people who are being denied access to vote, education, facilities.
The same thing happened in Brownsville that happened all over, in many areas of the South during those times. There was violence, and and sometimes it got personal. Actually, what I was doing didn't suit either side very well. And I look back and cannot imagine how I made a living and how I stayed county attorney, for instance. I was elected by the members of the county commission. And I'm not sure, but there were some incidents directed to us personally that were really scary. Here I am in town, a young guy trying to make a living with two children now and a wife, depending entirely on the public for my livelihood, living in a very tumultuous environment, and somehow it all worked.
But tell us about one experience that happened in your front yard.
Well, we were disturbed at night once, and noise out front, and it turned out that we assumed it was a KKK burned a cross in our driveway. That's pretty scary when you have two small children and a wife. And anyway, that was pretty dramatic. They also burned one in the yard of my good friend Kirby Mathern, who was later Court of Appeals judge and who was the chairman of the school board at that time. There were some people in Haywood County who really didn't like the way that we were conducting the county's business. And on the other side, there were people who thought we were doing far too little and should be doing much more.
And throughout that time, you mentioned there was violence, and you mentioned there were people on both sides who disagreed with what you were doing. Did you ever feel like just putting it down and taking off?
I suspect that Lib and I had those conversations. I knew by then I could probably make a living practicing law in easier places, but no, not seriously. I mean, we were there. That's home. We
Right.
stay and do it.
And it's still home.
Still home. Live in the same house. Same house where that event happened.
Well, and you mentioned that you had two children by that time. Tell us about your
Right.
children.
Betsy was born in 1959, the year I ran for General Sessions judge. As I said, that's the year I lost my hair. I ran for office, had a child, and built a house all in 1 year. But then Martha Lyle was born while we were in Nashville with the Attorney General's office. Two daughters, and we're lucky beyond expectation because they both still live. They both have come back to Brownsville, and they live there now.
And I believe you have
3 grandchildren.
3 grandchildren.
Walker Thornton, 11, Eliza Ford, 10, and Maddie Ford, 7.
Now, you mentioned that you were county attorney. You came back in 1963 after being in the Attorney General's office, went back to practice as the law office of Lyle Reed or Lyle Reed attorney.
Right.
Somewhere along the line, this guy Banks got in there. Who
Yes,
was that?
Larry came. He graduated from Vanderbilt. He's from Brownsville, and he came in. I think it was 70, 71, somewhere along there. And he, had always starts. He worked for me for some period of time. I don't remember. And then we became partners, and we remained partners until I stopped the practice in '86.
Now, Larry Banks, I know very well, is a good lawyer, and Lyle Reed's a good lawyer. So what kind of law did y'all practice?
We practiced whatever walked in the door. We practiced, in the early days, I did plaintiff's work, personal injury, workers' comp, that sort of thing. Later on, I ended up defending some of those companies that I had sued. They needed a lawyer, or needed another lawyer, or something. Anyway, so it was a pretty general practice. We did a lot of real estate work. We did You know, in a small town, you have to know everything. It's scary what you have to know. And many occasions I've told a client or a prospective client, look, I don't know as much about that kind of law as I should know. And I have some good friends in Memphis, and why don't I just send you on down there to them? Well, why don't you start out, and we'll see if we need anybody along the way. You know, people are very loyal to their lawyers. They may criticize us, but when the rubber hits the road, you are their very best friend, and they want you by their side.
Well, let me ask you this. Living in a small town like Brownsville or out from Brownsville and practicing law there, did you ever get paid in vegetables?
Actually not. I can't claim that. No, I never. Sometimes I didn't get paid, but I did.
So you wish you'd gotten paid in
I
vegetables.
wish I'd have gotten some vegetables, but never did any. I had some gifts. Many a times people would bring homegrown vegetables to the office when they came up to see me. Yes, that was nice. It's a friendly place.
But tell us, you mentioned that you started a bank with your father-in-law, and then later on y'all sold that bank not too long ago, I think, right?
That's right. You know how banks have been doing in the last few years. They've been merging, and this was not in Brownsville. Libba was from Fayette County, Somerville, the town adjoining us on the south, and her people had lived there for generations. Her grandmother's place, grandparents' place, we have put into a sort of a family trust, and we still keep that as a family place to go.
Well, I'm going to break in now and let's talk about Libba. I think one of the more interesting things in your life is Libba.
Lots of men have told me that.
But tell the Historical Society and the fellows about Libba.
Well, of course, our I don't think I had no thought of getting married that soon. It was ridiculous, actually, absurd, to get married in my situation with 3 years of college left and prospects of starting to practice law. But anyway, we fell in love, and we were married within 9 months. Happily, Betsy waited a while to come along. I don't know how we would have managed with a child at that time. But she has, what can you say about a woman that you love and have lived and loved for 55 years?
I want you to tell us a little bit about her travels.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess one of the things that has made our relationship work as well as it is, we agreed early on that we would, we were very fond of each other, but neither of us was the end all in our lives. So the thing that she has done a lot is to travel. In fact, in a few days, she's heading for, again, I don't know how many times, 3, 4, maybe even perhaps 5. That seems absurd, but I think it's right. Trip to Nepal and Tibet and Bhutan this time. She loves the mountains. Earlier, she climbed a mountain. She climbed Kilimanjaro. She climbed Mount Kenya, and she's been around the Himalayas a lot. And now she rides, but I ask her, why do you go? You don't keep a diary? You don't take photographs? Why do you go? She says, I like to go and look and feel.
And why don't you go?
In this early arrangement that we had, my interest tended more towards the warmer climates. I used to sail a lot before I went on to the Supreme Court. I would go to the Caribbean, not at the same time that she was. Someone had to stay home with the children. But in February, for a good number of years, I would go down to the Caribbean find a small sailboat that was going out for a week or 2 or 3. Just they needed a deckhand, I'd sign on, and we did that. And over the years, we have tried not to get in each other's way too much, and so there is a book that we both like. It's a very well-known book, The Prophet by Gibran, that says that the oaks and the cypress don't grow in each other's shade. So we may not be oaks and cypresses, but we ascribe to that wisdom.
And both of you have been involved in charitable work. Excuse me, I'm got a frog in my throat.
Yes.
And both of you have served on boards. Tell us about the boards.
Well, I guess the longest continuing common interest was the Methodist Health System in Memphis. I was on the board for a long time. And then when I left, when I became a judge, she reminds everybody that she didn't take my place. She was selected in her own right, and she was the first woman on that particular board. And she has continued her interest in that. She's been involved with the Nature Conservancy and other conservation groups.
All right. What do you do physically? You still play tennis?
I played tennis till I hurt my leg 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I think by a week from Sunday I'll be able to play again.
And Libba hikes?
Libba hikes. I work in the garden, and she's more disciplined about it than I am, which doesn't surprise you since you know me pretty well. We grow flowers now. Her version of it is that I plant and she weeds. I wouldn't tell it exactly like that, but her version is probably very near the truth.
Okay, I want to finish up this first section with questions about. You went to 1986 and you practiced law with Larry Banks.
Yes.
That's Reed and Banks.
Right.
In Brownsville, Tennessee, and then all of a sudden, Lyle Reed's not practicing law. Why?
Well, I went in to explain it to Larry. I said, Larry, this subject, this is the first time that we had ever talked about this. We had, Houston, you make a lot of money, but a lot of lawyers in small towns don't make a lot of money. But we made enough. We made enough.
Some of us fake it like we make money.
We made enough, and we had a good practice, and in all the years that Larry and I were together, we never had a crossword. That's really honest, and I give him all the credit, because those who know me well know that sometimes I'm not the easiest person to for a moment anyway, to get along with. But he, as you say, he is a very good lawyer, and everything was going just fine. And I went in to explain to him how I felt, and I said, all these years I have been, when I walked up the hill to the courthouse, sometimes I was well prepared, sometimes I was not very well prepared, sometimes I liked the case, sometimes it was a mess that I didn't know what I was going to do with, but it was always exciting, always exciting. The block up the hill to the courthouse was always you know how it is, you start to get a little tingle in your stomach, and your blood starts pumping and everything starts going, and you just can't wait to get at it, even if it's a very unimportant case. It's important to me and it's important to you, and you know what I'm talking about. But that stopped happening. And I told him, I said, it isn't really fun anymore. I have to have this conversation with myself on the way to the courthouse to get myself whipped up to try the lawsuit. And I've always told my children to leave the party while you're having fun. Don't let it die around you. And I have loved the practice of law, and I've done it for 30 years, and almost every day, though it has been difficult and frustrating, and at times disappointed with myself, disappointed with anything, but always exciting, and it's not anymore. So I'm going to quit. And well, first of all, he thought I was sick, and I said, no, I'm fine. As far as I know, I'm fine. What are you going to do? I don't have any idea. I just know I'm not going to practice law anymore because I am not. It doesn't excite me, and I love it so much that I'm not going to let it die that way. I'm not going to become a cantankerous, old, ill-tempered person who's doing something that he's pretending he likes to do it still, and I don't, so I'm quitting. So I quit. I said, close up the business, send me a check whenever, as time goes along, send me a check, that's fine. Whatever you sign, it's fine.
And so you quit.
I quit.
And I think right now we'll quit and take a break.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that in 1986 you just decided to tell Larry Banks you were going to quit practicing law. Now, here you have, I know you've had a successful practice over 30 years, but all of a sudden you just decide, I'm not doing this anymore, but you don't say what you're going to do. Isn't that just kind of casting your fate to the wind?
Well, I guess so. I've always had a sense that somehow things would work out. And I guess there were two considerations. One is, what are you going to do to fill the days? What is it that's interesting? What is it that you will find anything like as compelling and exciting as a practice of law? And the other one is a matter of economics. Over the years, during my practice, I have been really lucky in picking business partners as well as professional partners. So there was a young man came into my office one day and said, you and I should buy this radio station. It's for sale. And he was a very young man. His name is Carlton Veers, and I had a session with him this morning. We're still business partners. And I said, well, Carlton, why don't you sit down and tell me why you and I should buy this radio station? He did. We bought it. And we still own that, and we've done other things that have turned out okay. And other people have come along, and luck would have it, things have worked out very well. So I wasn't worried about not being able to feed my family, but I did know that I had to find something to do. And to the rescue came Ned McWhirter.
Okay, I want to ask you about that, but I want to back up because you and I have known each other a long time, and
we've even had some lawsuits together.
Yes, we've actually opposed each other. I want to ask you about an event that kind of you told us about the cross burning in your yard.
Right.
You went on to work the next day, as I understand it.
There's no place else to go.
You decide that it's time to quit practicing law, and you just decide, well, I'm quitting, and I'm going to do something else. How do you, what in your lifetime has affected you in such a way that you don't worry about the future? You said at the beginning of this interview, you don't look at the past very much.
No. Well, several things, I guess. I grew up as on a poor farm in West Tennessee, and I got the scholarship. Things just kind of happened when they were supposed to happen, I guess. And one of the more dramatic things, and maybe this is what you're talking about, when I was in the Air Force and I couldn't fly and I didn't want to do some of the other things that were suggested, I went to Camp Gordon, Georgia for military training, and we had a leave during Christmas. I came home and had an accident, so that I was delayed in getting back to Camp Gordon and finishing my training. The guys that I had been with went to China. It was just before Korea. It was just before China came into the war. And a year or so later, another graduate of the Camp Gordon Military Police School joined our unit. And he asked me when I had graduated and said, anyway, he told me that all of my buddies, all the people who were in my class were killed when the Chinese crossed the border into Korea. Well, having an accident wasn't a lot of fun, but it probably saved my life, and that sort of thing has happened. So, I don't know, maybe I just have a lot of faith that things will work out, and they always have. It's part spiritual, part religious, part pragmatic.
But speaking of faith, I know, and at the end of this interview, I want to make sure I ask you about something that we've discussed called restorative justice. But I want to, before we get to that, you mentioned that you served on the board at Methodist Hospital Systems.
Right.
Have you been involved in any other way in the Methodist Church?
Well, I have in many ways. Perhaps the thing that relates to what we're talking about today, I don't remember how many years. I tell you, I have trouble looking back and remembering. But for a good number of years, I was the chancellor, that is, legal counsel to the Methodist bishop, which is my church. Before that, I had a very interesting experience representing the Southern Baptist Foundation in will contest cases, but representing a bishop is truly, I suspect, a unique legal situation. I got acquainted with 2 or 3 bishops over the period of time, and it's a different perspective of the law.
Right. So we're talking about ecclesiastical law.
We're talking about the preachers who go wrong, and church property, and ethical dilemmas. Where do they become legal dilemmas? Kind of like the law practice you and I do, but about interesting subjects and people.
All right, so now I want to go back to you quit practicing law, and along came your friend Ned McWhirter.
Along came Ned McWhirter. Well, he had just been elected governor, and he asked me if I would serve as his deputy commissioner of commerce and insurance, which is the business department of state government, one of those, and one that I was interested in. The regulatory boards are in that department of insurance. So it was a good place for me, and so I did, and I I stayed there for a little less than a year, when Judge Mark Walker, who was the presiding judge of the Court of Criminal Appeals, announced that he would not seek re-election. Was it that, or did he retire? Forgotten. Anyway, it was his vacancy. And so I applied for that position and was appointed by Governor McWhirter as Judge of the Court of Criminal Appeals in 1987.
All right. I want to talk about your experience at the commissioner's office. Okay. Who was the commissioner?
The commissioner was an absolutely delightful woman named McReynolds.
And Commissioner McReynolds, was she an African American?
She was.
And her first name was Elaine?
Her first name was Elaine. And she and I had a lot of fun together. And she has helped in my career since then. But we had a very diverse department all the regulatory boards, insurance, a whole bunch of stuff, commerce, and we. I remember one occasion when we got there, there were lawyers all over the place. Every little section had a lawyer. So I said, well, Commissioner, what we should do with these lawyers is put them all in one office, and they can cross-learn each other's business, and we'll have a more efficient and really a more reasonable arrangement. These people just kind of, I was worried that they weren't working hard enough, if you really want to know the truth. So anyway, that did not meet with great favor. And
among the lawyers.
Among the lawyers and the boards, their clients, they had a nice, pleasant arrangement. They didn't want it disturbed. And I was complaining to the commissioner that it looked like the perfectly reasonable thing to do, and everybody was resisting. And she gave me a name that I shouldn't have told my family, and I probably shouldn't tell it here. But she said, well, you come in here like a big wind. What do you expect? Just to blow people away and they all fall in line? So around the household, I have been referred to on more than one occasion as the big wind.
Okay. And the lawyers stayed where they were?
No. They got into a legal division of the commerce and insurance and commerce.
So at least that time the big wind blew.
The big wind blew.
All right.
But it was such a reasonable thing to do that eventually enough people thought it was the right thing.
While you were serving as commissioner, did you move to Nashville?
No. From the time that I left the Attorney General's office, I've always gone home on the weekend. Court of Criminal Appeals, of course, sat here in Jackson. At least that's where the office was. And even on the Supreme Court and whatever, and my time with White, Tarrant, and Combs, everything before I came to you, I always came home on the weekends.
All right. Now let's talk about your service. You mentioned that Judge Walker retired and then you went on the Court of Criminal Appeals.
Right.
Tell us about that experience.
Well, it was a very interesting experience in my early days. As in practice, I had done a fair amount of criminal practice, as all lawyers, particularly young lawyers in rural county. It was before the days of the Office of Public Defender, and if you didn't get hired, you got appointed. So you ended up in court. And I had, the criminal law had interested me, not so much the practice as just the concept of criminal justice. Getting into it from the perspective of a judge, looking at principles of criminal jurisprudence, the constitutional issues particularly, was very interesting. We had there were some excellent judges on that court, Sissy Daughtry for one, Al Birch, Gary Wade, a lot whose names don't come right to the top of my head, but pretty much without exception, they were very capable, congenial judges, and I enjoyed learning criminal law, perhaps again, more than I had ever known it. And I enjoyed the 3-judge panels that we went around the state. And the Court of Criminal Appeals moved around from the 3 grand divisions, not like the Court of Appeals, which pretty much sits in its grand division. But the Criminal Appeals, in my view, the arrangement is better because you make up a new panel out of the entire court every time. The personal interaction, the dynamics, and the opinions are different. If you get 3 like-minded people sitting in the same court, you can sort of expect what's going to happen. But if you make up a new panel every time the court meets, you get and that interaction and that involvement with different people was the great joy of the Court of Criminal Appeals.
And you mentioned Sissy Daughtry, who went on to be on the Tennessee Supreme Court and is now at the Sixth Circuit
Yes.
Court of Appeals in Cincinnati.
And Al Birch, who came to the Supreme Court a little later than I did.
And now
Gary Wade, who's now on the Supreme Court.
Right.
All really good lawyers.
So let me ask you this. Was there a difference in the way you were treated by your friends and lawyers after you went on the Court of Criminal Appeals?
My jokes weren't nearly as, were a lot funnier than they had been before. But you miss, I don't know what it is. I do know what it is, because even after I've been on the court and back practicing law, I still have that sense of deference to judges, and I don't just walk up and slap Frank DeWoder on the back while he was still on the Supreme Court and say, "Hey, Frank, you remember when we used to do so-and-so?" There is, and appropriately so, there is that sense of respect for the office and usually for the judge himself or herself.
What, if anything, do you recall now that was significant in your service on the Court of Criminal Appeals in terms of the jurisprudence?
Well, of course, you have to learn to be a judge. One of the things of great value that I didn't have. I look back and think about it. There are two things that I really missed as a lawyer. One was having a strong mentor lawyer. I had to look, since I started practice alone, I didn't have any partners and no one in the office to talk to until Larry came along some 8 or 10 years later. And so in a way I had to sort of make it up as I went along, and I did that by watching other lawyers, how they did it, and how the good ones did it, and how the poor ones did it also. So I missed that then, and I realized that I would have been a better lawyer if I had had a strong mentor early on in the practice. The other thing that is absent from my career is having been a trial judge. I was never a trial judge. So on the Court of Criminal Appeals, you've got to get this judging in your head, how you do it, what are the standards, how do you make decisions, and when you get ready to write an opinion, what do you say and how do you say it? And that was the big difference in becoming a judge from having been a lawyer. As a lawyer, you know what you're going to say. You're going to take the position that's best to the best advantage of your client. As a judge, you're there and having to look at it from a different perspective.
How long did you serve on the Court of Criminal Appeals?
From 87 to 90.
And then what happened?
And then I told you things just work out. Judge Phones, who was from Memphis, was on the Supreme Court, announced that he would not seek re-election to the Supreme Court. And so I had enjoyed my gig on the Court of Criminal Appeals, and I said, well, why not the Supreme Court? Let's just have a go at it. So I ran for that office.
And you were elected?
I was elected, along with, the new members of the court were Riley Anderson and Sissy Daughtry, and myself. Frank DeWoder was reelected, as was Charles O'Brien.
And how long did you serve on the Supreme Court then?
I served almost the term out, 8 years. I left a few months early.
All right, I want to talk about the Supreme Court and in particular your experience there. How long were you there before you were elected as Chief Justice?
Well, actually the first day I was Chief Justice. That was an interesting experience. I spent a lot of my time asking Frank DeWoder, "Can we do this?" Or "How do you do that?" And he was very generous in his in his information and his knowledge. To say it was a challenge, certainly to someone of my ability and experience, it certainly was a great challenge. It was very interesting. There were three new members of the court. There was Frank Dorota had been on the court for a number of years. I can't remember exactly, maybe 1980, or longer. I'm not sure when he got there. Been there a long time. There was a little bit of a sense of the new people on the court, and two who had been around a while, but we worked together very well in the sense that we worked together, I think, productively. It was very diverse opinions as to a lot of things, maybe almost everything. And
But I want to back up, if we could, and about the Court of Criminal Appeals. You were appointed by Governor McWhorter.
right.
And then you were elected to the Supreme Court. Is that correct?
Yes.
Tell us.
The jury.
Yeah, tell the jury that's going to watch this, tell posterity, as you and I talked about. Tell us the distinction between how people were nominated and appointed to the Court of Criminal Appeals and how they got to the Supreme Court.
Well, the Supreme Court, of course, was a statewide election, but the real important part was getting the Democratic nomination, and we did that by each of us separately going to the members of the Democratic Executive Committee all over the state, and I drove all over the state, hunting them down and asking them to support me to be one of the nominees for the election to the Supreme Court. That was a very interesting experience. All over the state, very, very different people, very different interests. The questions they would ask you: would you do this or that, or I can't support you unless you support somebody else, or something. Anyway, it was a pretty interesting process to being selected by the executive committee, and I did have opposition in that regard, and but I think that because I was then a member of the Court of Criminal Appeals, probably gave me the advantage necessary to get the Democratic Committee nomination. And then from there, the five of us, the five Democratic nominees, campaigned across the state. We campaigned as a group, and the question was whether or not the Republican Party would also nominate a slate of officers for the Supreme Court. There was some discussion of that. We ran our campaign on the assumption that we would have opposition. We went to, I've forgotten, one time I knew, but it was almost all the counties in the state. The five of us went and met people on the courthouse lawns, went into the courtroom, talked to the mayors. You know what you do when you campaign for office.
Well, what would you do you think that's a good way to elect Supreme Court justices,
No,
or how do you think we ought to do that?
One of the first things that I set out to change when I became a judge of the Supreme Court, justice, and since I had been chosen as the Chief Justice, it was my initiative. I mean, I was the front person on changing the selection process, and as you know, it did become part of it had been the modified Missouri plan, but somewhere along the way it got renamed the Tennessee plan, and that was one of our first, and it wasn't entirely selfish. I mean, we had the office for 8 years, and if we couldn't be do our job well enough to get reelected in 8 years, what? But it was more for years to come, and some of the things that were happening in states around Texas, North Carolina, Georgia. Candidates for the Supreme Court were spending millions of dollars and doing it in such a way that it did not foster the perception of impartiality. In some states, different interests like trial lawyers or big law firms or defense interests, insurance companies, product manufacturing associations really became active, and it wasn't any secret why they were active. They were looking for a favorable vote on those states' Supreme Court, and it doesn't look good. It is not good, and so we set out to change that, and we did. John Wilder, Lieutenant Governor John Wilder, and I, and with the support of the other members of the court, and obviously with a majority of the General Assembly. Now, it didn't come out the cleanest, prettiest product that you would like to have, because even though we were trying to get politics out of the selection process, politics was very much involved in formulating the plan. And everyone who's read the statute knows the hoops that you have to jump through to get the process done. But it is, in its final analysis, I think the best plan that any state that I knew anything about, and certainly was better than what our state was doing before. It's not an easy process either to get the nomination.
That's through the Judicial Selection
Through the Judicial Selection Commission. It's an understatement to say that it's not an easy process to get the nomination, and then the governor makes the final choice. But even beyond that, once you get on the court, there is a very meaningful review process, and it is somewhat difficult for judges, because a lot of it is done by people that you work with every day, with people that you hire, as a matter of fact, clerks and people that report to you. And it's not too. They write out their evaluation of you, and if you have had occasion to find fault with their performance, it'll show up on that evaluation form. So it's not perfect, but it certainly does give everyone an opportunity to express a view as to how well you have done. The other side of that is that being a member of the Supreme Court is not a popularity contest, and some things have to be done that aren't popular with trial judges, aren't popular with clerks. One of the many things that we did, we started looking at secretaries to judges, trial judges, all kinds of judges, and some of them simply didn't work at all. I mean, they just had a salary. Court reporters, cozy arrangements, clerks. In other words, it was the judiciary is, next to the Methodist Church, it is probably the most intransigent bureaucracy I've ever undertaken to have any dealings with. Everybody has a little comfort zone, and they don't like to be disturbed, understandably so. But on the other hand, you don't disturb just for the sake of disturbing. You disturb because the thing that we are, our mission is justice and efficiency in the accomplishment of justice, and some sort of efficiency as to time and money and to render justice, and not only impartiality but the perception of impartiality. And to take on that task is a considerable task.
But when you were Chief Justice, you said that you were, obviously you were able to successfully accomplish the idea that we have the Judicial Selection Commission. And you were able to do those things. Were you frustrated about some of the things you could not do?
Well, the next thing that I think about the same time that we were trying to get the the selection process, another huge problem was a matter of jurisdiction. When we went on the court in 1990, the Supreme Court spent more than half of its time deciding workers' compensation cases. That had been a political impasse, and the people that were in favor, the way they put it, of an elected judge deciding workers' compensation cases had enough political influence that we couldn't reach any other. So I announced to some of those guys, well, I'm not going to spend 8 years trying workers' compensation cases. I love them and they're important, but that's not what the Supreme Court is supposed to do. It's not what we're going to do. And the final resolution of that was well, it's all perfectly obvious what had to be said, and it was said. I said the court has the inherent power to appoint masters. So we're either going to change it by statute or we're going to change it by the inherent powers of the court. And you're not going to be arguing the case before me, you're going to be arguing your case before a master appointed by the Supreme Court. And we'll read his findings of fact and conclusions of law and make a decision. That is the inherent power of the court. And I think that was a new thought to some people. And as it turned out, with all of our blustering on both sides, I think what a very effective way, and it's still the way it's still done. There is a panel of 3 judges, not Supreme Court judges, though when I left, I had promised that a Supreme Court judge will sit on every panel. That made good sense, because for continuity, for the detection of issues that ought to be brought to the Supreme Court and resolved, because workers' compensation is the area of law that affects people who need justice quickly, and they don't need to wait around 3 or 4 years to find out if their injury is covered. They got bills to pay, and they need justice right now. And it was a more expeditious way of deciding the cases. And as it turned out, my friends who were in favor of the old system found it was very satisfactory. And I think we're still doing it that way.
We are. And now you served as the Chief Justice for how long?
4 years.
And what's the difference in what a Chief Justice does and an Associate Justice?
The Chief Justice is the administrative head of the court system, in the sense that the Chief Justice is the person on the court who interacts with the administrative office of the court. It is the person who interacts with the lower courts, by and large, trial courts and the intermediate courts. And the Chief Justice most of the time presides at the hearings and assigns the cases and is responsible for moving the business of the court along in whatever way.
Then you served as an Associate Justice under Justice Anderson as Chief Justice. Was that correct?
Well, after my time as Chief Justice, it rotated a while. I think it went back to a seniority concept. I think maybe O'Brien was the next Chief Justice, and then Riley Anderson I believe, finished out that term, my term. I left in 1998 before the term of court actually ended.
And when you were Chief Justice, you make a lot of speeches.
Not very many. I made speeches to the bar associations, to the judicial conference. Being a Chief Justice is a full-time job. It is hard work, and particularly with the initiatives that we undertook during my tenure as Chief Justice. So
one of those initiatives was the Futures Commission.
Futures Commission, gender fairness, racial fairness, gender neutral video project, interaction with the federal judges in Tennessee for cooperation and some common projects.
And out of that, I believe the federal courts now can certify questions to the Tennessee Supreme Court.
Yes, that was one of the results, and we, during my term on the court, we accepted almost all of the issues that were certified to the court. When the decision depended upon significant state law issues, we would just render an opinion and send it back. That became the law of that federal case.
All right. In Tennessee, the Supreme Court sits in Knoxville and in Nashville and Jackson. Right. And sometimes even in Memphis.
That was one of the things that we began in our first few years on the court. Memphis was then the largest city in the state, a lot of legal business, and it seemed reasonable for the court to make an appearance there.
Is there any difference in the quality or of issues and lawyers across the state when you sit in the different divisions?
There are, I suspect Tennessee has, on balance, really fine lawyers. There are some outstanding lawyers in Tennessee. And there are good lawyers from Memphis, there are good lawyers from Knoxville and Nashville. I suspect those differences have blurred in recent years. One thing that hasn't blurred completely is the way they practice in the different grand divisions. There's still a lot of this regional personality that shows up in the kinds of lawsuits, in the numbers of lawsuits, and actually in some important instances in how the lawyers conduct themselves. East Tennessee has always been the most litigious part of the state. They really have a lawsuit about some some seemingly unimportant issues, but to them they are very important. And yes, there are good lawyers all over. There are lawyers all over that you would wish they had prepared a little better.
Why did you decide to step down
from the
Supreme Court?
From the Supreme Court? Well, that may be the only question you've asked me that I don't know the answer to, maybe. There were several considerations. And maybe the answer is found, part of the answer is found in the evolution of the court or the development of the court or whatever happened on the court. We started with Sissy Daughtry, Riley Anderson, Frank Giroux, and Charles O'Brien and myself. There were some of us, a majority, who felt that there probably the administration of justice could be improved, I guess is a good way of saying it. And we set out to do it. One of the most interesting things was something you mentioned, the Futures Commission, chaired by John Siegenthaler, the publisher of the Nashville Tennessean. And the members of that commission were among the most outstanding business and professional people in the state, not many lawyers. And they took on a project that lasted a couple of years. And the question that we asked them to look at was, how should the administration of justice happen 20 years from now, the futures? We had to set it in the future because everyone who is a part of the system has a vested interest in the present. And there's no way you could even think about changing much with everybody resisting. So we put it out in the future and said, let's plan for the future. And then do things as we're able, politically, financially, whatever. Change our mind is not the thing to do. Let's talk about it. And that commission rendered what is considered, I think, by many people to be an excellent document, an excellent blueprint for the judiciary to strive for. Of course, Sissy went to the Court of Criminal Appeals. Sissy and I hope she would.
Sixth Circuit.
Sixth Circuit, sorry. I hope she would not be offended by my saying that we were soul spirits. We disagreed about cases, we disagreed always friendly, but we had some very serious disagreements about how specific issues ought to be resolved. But by and large, we had sort of a same sense of administering justice and what the courts ought to do. And when she left, it was disappointing. And then Al Birch came on. I believe that's the sequence. And Al is delightful, very progressive, good lawyer. And then when Penny White came on, that was really a bright light because Penny was very, very bright, very, very dedicated, and a very most congenial person to work with. And we all know what happened to Penny. Tragedy. She probably would have been one of the best justices of the Supreme Court over a period of 20 years that we never had. So that was truly sad when she was not allowed to continue her career. Somewhere along the way, we lost some of our enthusiasm.
Well, did the Penny White election or
I
rejection?
suspect so. I expect so. I don't know. I don't know what's in my colleagues' minds, but I know that we lost some of our enthusiasm for change, for improvement, for taking on controversial issues and things like that.
Well, I want to ask one other area before I leave the Supreme Court. We can spend, as you know, you and I can spend hours and hours and hours doing this, but I want to ask an area about death penalty cases. Obviously, the rejection campaign for Penny White was based upon one case and her opinion in that one case, and it was a death penalty case. Right. What, in your view, was the difficulty with death penalty cases, and what is the difficulty with death penalty cases in Tennessee?
Well, I'm sure that every member of the court who we all held up our hand and swore to support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Tennessee. Well, the Constitution of the state of Tennessee means what the Supreme Court of Tennessee says it means. That's not being flipped, that's just the structure. And And the legislature had authorized death penalty as a punishment for first-degree murder, and nobody disputed that. The most of the discussions about, and this is obvious in the opinions, was about who under the law was met the standard, the criteria for being executed, and there developed sort of the shorthand phrase of the worst of the worst. So there were some honest, and I think all the differences were heartfelt, honest, intellectually, and legally as to who are the worst of the worst, and how many worst of the worst are there? Are there 100? Are they 10? Are they 5%, 10%, whatever? Or what are the circumstances? And the other thing is, how do you determine who's worst of the worst? Our trial system improved dramatically during the period of time that I was on the court. When I went on the court, the death penalty cases would come up were not good. The lawyers had not, in many instances, had not done a good job. They had not recognized that the death penalty is a unique set of law, and the circumstance, the penalty makes it unique, and it has to be treated in a different way. It can't be just another criminal case. It's not just another criminal case. It's a death penalty case. And so not to be heroic about it, but in addition to being Chief Justice, I believe that I wrote an opinion, either dissenting or concurring on every death penalty case that came before the court while I was there. That takes an enormous amount of energy, which sort of takes us back to the question you asked me, why did I not seek re-election? I was pretty tired. I was not as excited as I had been about the prospects of our following the plan of the Futures Commission. There were some other things that I wanted to do. I wanted to include the General Sessions judges as part of the court system, because in reality, that's where justice is or isn't. And by and large, we have now across the state really fine, capable, dedicated General Sessions judges. I thought that their role in the system could be improved, that if they were state judges, they would have a greater sense of significance and participation with the system as a whole. I could see some efficiencies in jurisdiction, and then, of course, the Futures Commission contemplated district judges with jurisdiction across the board. All of those were, to me, really exciting things, and I wanted to work on them as long as there was a prospect of success. I was kind of tired. We were not as enthusiastic as we had been, and you know by now that I get bored easily.
What came along to convince you?
Well, I'm not through with why I left. I had a very interesting offer, and I'm not going to pretend that the financial aspects of it were not part of the reason. I was offered a position with HCA, Columbia HCA Hospital Corporation, which was involved in some really exciting, and to them, some not so happy investigations and cases.
I believe they had a lot of Medicare fraud allegations.
They had many issues involving their business of being in the health care. There were class action lawsuits. There were suits against the directors, suits against the officers, just about every way that you can think of suing a company, that was going on. And the job that they asked me to take was to be head of the litigation section. We didn't actually try the cases, we managed the cases, which meant that we would hire the lawyers and monitor the cases as they went along and approve their payment and all that.
Who offered you that job?
Dr. Friss had come back as president of HCA, and he asked me would I be interested in it. And then I talked to the then general counsel, and we reached an agreement.
All right. And you did that for how long?
I did that for 2 years.
Then what'd you do?
Then again, most of that business settled down, and it was understood that my age and my interest and such, it would be a short-term assignment. I was there 2 years. We had talked in terms of 3 years when I signed on. Certainly not because of my efforts, but the efforts in general. Things had pretty much settled down at HCA, and it was a good time for me to go. And they said thank you, and we'll do all these things we told you we'd do, and so I left.
And was there a precedent for a justice leaving the court for a position like that or a practice like that, to your knowledge? Are you the first one to do that?
I can't think of one who did that. So all those things together, if one thing had been different, would I have asked to be renominated? I'm sure that there are people who might suspect that I was afraid that I would meet the same fate as Penny. Well, losing never has been much of a deterrence for me. I've lost so many battles and so many arguments that it's really not a particularly significant circumstance. One of the things that we didn't talk about, I ran for state senate one time.
I was just about to ask about that.
And just got my brains beat out.
I believe back in 1970, what? 1978, you ran for the state senate, which included my county.
Yes.
And you ran against a senator by the name of Bill Jim Davis.
Who was of what was the name of that outfit? The American Party or some
Independent
somebody
Party.
Connected with George Wallace, and
Right.
it offended me greatly that my state senator was connected with George Wallace, and I couldn't think of anything to do but run against him, which was a poorly advised political undertaking because, as I say, I got soundly beat. But I was of the opinion that we could work the politics out and I could get reelected. I was not the most liberal judge on that court, whatever the perception was. There were some areas in which I held their feet to the fire that were I think good for the state. So I thought that I've always thought I could work something out. So I thought that we would work it out politically, or if it came to a heads on, what would be more fun than to run against an organization that saw Penny White as a poor justice just because of one opinion. I can make my speech right now. I mean, I could think it would be just fun and games to go up and down the state talking about what a great judge Penny White was and how much I would like to be like her. So there were several circumstances, and whether it was the right thing to do or not, I have a sense that maybe I should have stayed on and slugged it out in the trenches, but there were other fun things to do.
So then you went to HCA, and then you left there, and you went where?
Charles Bone is a good friend of yours, a good friend of mine. He asked me if I would like to learn how to practice law in a big city law firm, and I said, I haven't done that yet, so maybe that would be a good thing to do. So they had an office in Nashville and one in Memphis and in other areas of the Southeast. This was a Kentucky law firm, I think. And so
firm name was what again?
White, Tarrant, and Combs. Governor Combs of Kentucky was one of their people, I think. Anyway, that was there's some very great lawyers, really bright lawyers. Charles Bone is a lot of fun to work with. And the good thing is they kind of let me do what I knew how to do, and not a whole lot. Didn't require me to do a whole lot of that. And so I stayed there until finally I just, years are, if you do the arithmetic on when it all started, you kind of know where I was getting to. And then, lo and behold, Houston Gordon offers me a job in Covington, which is a 30-minute drive across a nice, pretty countryside. And that's where I went, and that's where I am.
Do you have fun?
I'm having fun, and I hope you are.
Let's take a break.
Okay.
Judge Reed, I want to ask you some questions as we near the end of our session, and one of the questions I want to ask you is about how do you define what a good judge is?
Oh my gosh. Well, there are several characteristics. I think the first, it may sound a little odd, but would be a dedication to the concept of law, the rule of law. One of the most distressing things that I have ever heard a judge say was, election time is coming and the penalties are going to get stiffer. Others say, I don't care what the law is, what I'm doing is right. We all have different views of what is right, and a judge is the arbiter, and the judge ought to respect the law. We were having interviews for Attorney General one time, and I confessed to some mischievousness. I asked this one judge, this one applicant, and I sort of knew his history. I said, well, suppose you had a situation in which the law clearly required you to do this, but in your heart you knew that it ought to go the other way. Which would you do? Oh, well, I'd do what's right. Well, he didn't have a chance of getting my vote because he was substituting his ideas for justice over what is we all have agreed as a society, as a people, that we must respect the law. And so I think respect for the law, obviously impartiality, integrity, doesn't have to be real smart, really. That's to work hard, but it doesn't have to be real smart, just reasonably smart. I would rather have a judge with limited smarts anytime if he'll be fair, give me a chance to argue my case, and make a decision based on what he understands the law to be. So I think those are some of the qualities that I think are important.
During your term on the Supreme Court, Tennessee adopted comparative fault. It's modified comparative fault in Tennessee. And there's been some conversation that was a type of judicial activism. What are your comments on that?
Well, my first comment is that the judiciary is the third equal branch of government, and just as important, in some instances more important, than the other two. For instance, I never would have agreed, had I been on the court, for the legislature to pass on court rules. That was an accomplished fact when I got there. It did not seem to me it was the right thing to do, and were it before me, I would have said, no way will I give up the prerogative of the judiciary with regard to our court proceedings. We're
talking about comparative fault. Was that
comparative fault was a good example, but not the common law. There is not a rule for everything. The legislature has never thought of everything, and even if it had, it wouldn't fit all circumstances. So the court plays a role in law development, and that particular issue, comparative fault, negligence, in the beginning was a creature of the courts. Before the Parliament did not pass a law making negligence actionable or a cause of action, a court in England said that this particular incident, and I think I remember my law school, it was the defendant in that case had strung a wire across a public street, and a horseman had been decapitated or seriously injured from riding under it. The court said that's negligence, and there is an action on the case, I believe it was, in that case. And from that time on down, the development of negligent law has been a development of the common law. So compared to fault is nothing more than a development of the common law, and a very reasonable one in my view.
I want to ask you about the area of criminal justice. What is your view of where we are as a society and as a state with our criminal justice system?
Well, we don't do criminal justice very well. Whatever we say we're doing, we are punishing, and in my view, very little effort is made towards rehabilitation or saving the offender, saving them for some useful purpose. It is terribly expensive. It's expensive in the money that we hand out in the form of taxes spent for prisons, and it is terribly expensive in the way of human personality, because these people who get caught up in the system, it is most difficult to get out of the system. I have said somewhat irresponsibly, I think, that a deputy sheriff had more to do with the criminal justice system than I did as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, because it's the deputy sheriffs that put you in the system. And once in, it doesn't deal with people very well. So many young men, particularly young African American men, are going to prison, and without any real hope of ever surviving in any sort of responsible citizen, or even as a citizen who has a chance of participating in or having the things that some of us almost take for granted. There is a concept that favors rehabilitation over punishment that really, I think, comes nearer solving the problem on behalf of the victim, the state, as well as the offender. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I did recently, I met with the staff of, they asked me to come over and talk about it, the staff of the Wilder Training School at Somerville, which houses juvenile offenders. They're trying to start a restorative justice concept.
Now, I've heard you speak of restorative justice a lot. What does that mean?
Well, nobody knows what it means, really, at least I don't. It means a different way of looking at crime and punishment, a way that hopefully serves the interests of the victim. In the last few years, the legislature has passed what they call victims' rights. There's not really much substantive rights there, in the sense that the people who have been hurt their hurt is redressed in any sort of meaningful way. Almost the total emphasis on punishing the offender, and that's fine. I mean, if you do something wrong, you can expect things to not ever be quite the same, but there ought to be a system in which there is hopes of reconciliation. I suppose that my understanding of restorative justice is more of a reconciliation. There have been some good results. It doesn't fit. There are some people who are so bad and who are so violent and who are so totally destructive that they have to be locked up. But all the people who are locked up don't fit that category. And if you want to get into the causes and the mechanics of doing it, I think that our focus on drugs plays an important part in there. Restorative justice is a great concept in the sense that it hopes to do better for the victim as well as for the offender, and in no small way better for society generally.
And have you been giving seminars and lectures on that over the last few years?
Well, no, not lectures. I try to stay away from lectures. The women of the Methodist Church asked me to do a program, and I did it over a couple of day period, and then they had to have a program in their church, so they said, oh well, maybe Judge Reed will come to our program. So I've done the same sort of thing. I'm encouraged by the efforts that are being made by the staff at the Wilder Youth Center as to what some good might come of that. These are high school children. These are children who have never known, some of them have never known how to deal with conflict except first to yell, then to hit, and then to hit with a stick, and then to shoot. That's their experience with conflict management. And it's terrible, and we must be able to to provide a better system than that.
Well, you have had a lot of experience. As a lawyer and a judge, what's the difference now that you're back being a lawyer again? You walk in the courtroom, and here's the former Chief Justice of Tennessee Supreme Court, and he's in here to argue a motion or an appeal. What's the difference?
Well, I used to tell my colleagues on the court that I was a lawyer so long that I never would be a proper judge, and actually most of them agreed with me at the moment. But it is different. I do enjoy being a judge. My success, as a lawyer, I enjoy being a lawyer. My success as a lawyer has not been outstanding, and I wonder why you've kept me on. I've tried two cases in the Supreme Court and was a colossal failure on both of them. One of them was a negligence case, and I thought we had a slam dunk winner. We ended up losing 3-2, and in the process have been told that even in a common law action, doctors have no duty to third parties, which is the way I read the opinion, is kind of startling. I'm sure that's not what the court meant, and I'm sure they'll get around to dealing with that. So that wasn't so good. And then in a more recent endeavor, maybe tying up all the loose ends, so far as I'm concerned, on the Tennessee plan and how to select judges. Even after it was apparent that you would not be a member of the Supreme Court, at least not on this go-around, because of the situation that had developed. With your permission, we continued in the case in an effort to, if you will, protect the plan, which I had a lot to do with its beginning, and I think it's a good plan, and we both wanted it to be preserved. The Supreme Court again did not see fit to adopt our argument, which I thought was terribly simple and terribly right, but they didn't. So I can tell you one thing, that no deference is given former Chief Justices, and they smiled and say, nice to have you, let's hear your argument. Haven't been in the trial courts much. They have, everybody's always nice and everybody's very, very respectful, but they don't give you any quarter. And they shouldn't, absolutely not. I can tell you that making an argument before the Supreme Court is, I think in the last case that we had a loser, as it turned out. But I think that's the most fun 10 minutes I've had in a long time.
That's great. Let me ask you this. I've got two questions I want to ask you. One of them is a question I ask. In fact, they have it on the break room in our office, the question I ask. But the one I want to ask before that, what kind of people do you admire?
I admire, you know, there's a bit. When you get as old as I am, and you start to wonder, what could I have done? Here I've spent my life in Tennessee and had as many failures as I've had successes, and though I have enjoyed it, maybe if I had done things differently, I could have had more impact. I could have done things better. I think greatness and better and whatever can only make sense in the context of the moment. And the people that I admire the most are those who do what's before them well. And that's a lawyer, it's a chef, it's whatever it is, wherever you are in life. Don't worry too much about tomorrow. Don't worry too much about what people are going to say about you. Face up to what task you have taken and just look at it and try to do it. If it's writing a letter right now in our practice, if it's writing a letter to opposing counsel, sit down and write the very best letter that you can. Everything we do as a lawyer is we're an advocate. The simplest letter is advocacy. And if you're writing a letter, if you're writing a brief, if whatever, do it well and everything will be okay.
And the last question is, are we having fun yet?
We're having fun. I have to tell you that the practice of law and my experience on the court, and I think over the years I have experienced what I set out to find out about, how people are at their best and at their worst, and how are we, when it comes down to, I think, is the most fundamental thing among people that can be, and that is justice. Do we treat each other right? Why don't we? When don't we? What is justice and what is not in our civil relationship, in our family relationship, political, and that's what I think is the most important thing.
And now, is there anything that you want to say before we end this?
Well, yes, there is. I want to say thank you to Barry and the sponsors of this project, the Bar Foundation and the Historical Society. I want to thank you. I'm not altogether sure it's a good idea, but since you are doing it, I am pleased that you invited me to participate. And I want to thank you, Houston, for leading me through. I'm glad it was direct rather than cross-examination.